pole, and the little pine tree that stood beside my cabin door was a 2-strand barbed wire fence. And that year, one strand of wire had fallen down. It was uncommonly cold that year. But you know, I had plenty of firewood. I had plenty of beans and biscuit flour in the cupboard. I was doing pretty well. But when it got close to Christmas, I began to wish I had something a little fancier to eat. I started remembering all the good Christmas dinners I had at my mother's table when I was a boy. So, you know, when Christmas Eve arrived, I decided I should go hunting and get a wild turkey, and I could have turkey for my Christmas dinner. So the first thing I did that morning, I built up a big fire in the fireplace. I put on a good warm coat, and I got my shotgun, and I set out to hunt for a turkey. It was so cold that morning, the air made a crackling sound as I walked through it. You know, like the sound you hear when you break that thin skin of ice on a puddle on a cold morning? That's what it was sounding like. But I thought, oh, it's going to get warmer as the day goes on. I was mistaken about that. It kept getting colder and colder. It got so cold, the only way I could move forward was by breaking my way through the frozen air with the butt end of my shotgun. And I said to myself, the only turkey that's going to be out in weather like this is me. I'm going back to the cabin. I turned around and step by step, I broke my way through the frozen air. Finally, I made it back to the cabin door. When I arrived at the cabin door, I happened to look up. What do you think I saw? At the top of the little pine tree beside my cabin door, there was a big fat turkey gobbler. I said to myself, I guess I believe in Santa Claus after all. And I raised my shotgun and pulled the trigger. There was no sound. The sound of my shot got frozen in the air before it could even reach my ears. I thought I'd better spend this day inside the cabin. I went in, stomped the snow from my shoes. I walked over to the fire. I held my hands up by the fire to warm them up. There was no heat. And then I looked more carefully, and I saw that the flames were not moving. It was so cold. The fire in my fireplace had frozen. Each flame just stood there like an upside-down icicle, giving off a pale yellow or orange or bluish glow. I reached into the fireplace and broke off one of those frozen flames. It was smooth and glassy, a little bit slippery. In fact, it was so slippery, it slid from my fingers and landed on the rock in front of the fireplace and shattered into pieces. Each chip of frozen fire lay there on the hearth rock, giving off its pale orange or yellow or glow. You know what that made me think of? Christmas lights. Christmas lights that people had on their Christmas trees and decorating their houses in the towns and the cities all over the country. And I thought, well, maybe I can't be nice and warm. Maybe I can't have turkey for Christmas dinner, but I am going to have a Christmas tree. I got some string and tied a piece of string onto each broken chip of fire, and I carried them outside and hung them all over the pine tree beside the cabin door, from the ground clear up to the top. I stood back to admire my work, and I must say it made me feel proud. And then I went inside. I piled every blanket I could find on the bed. I decided I would spend the whole day in bed. I climbed under all those covers, and I must have been tired out by the cold because I fell asleep immediately. I slept all through the day. I slept all night long. I didn't wake up until the next morning. And what woke me up was a sudden blast, bam, outside of the cabin. I went diving under the bed wondering who was after me and what for. And then as my senses came back, I realized what must have happened. The temperature had risen just enough for the sound of my shot from the day before to finally reach my ears. I climbed out from under the bed feeling sort of sheepish. I walked over to the door and I opened it up. I was struck by a blast of heat. The chips of frozen fire had all thawed out and they set the pine tree ablaze. It was nothing short of a miracle that the whole cabin didn't go up in flames too. I turned away from the door. I felt like I had as much common sense as a guy who tries to find out if his gas tank is empty by taking off the cap and looking inside with a match. But then I noticed a delicious smell. I looked up. Sure enough, the fire had cooked the turkey at the top of the tree. It had roasted it to a turn. I got a long pole and knocked that turkey out, carried it inside, and got everything ready for my Christmas dinner. But you know what? That poor bird was so starved that the more of it I ate, the hungrier I got. I must have poked down 10 pounds of turkey until I felt so hollow inside, my stomach thought my throat had been cut. I said to myself, that is the last straw. I whipped up a batch of biscuits, I ate my fill, I packed up all of my goods, and I left that cabin. I left there swearing an oath to myself that I would spend the rest of my Christmases at home where I belong. And that is exactly what I have done too. Well, that was before I came to New Mexico. When I came to New Mexico, that's when I really started learning the old stories from right around here. I kept thinking, there's got to be a Christmas story. There's got to be a Christmas story. And sure enough, I did come across a Christmas story. And it happened right here in New Mexico. It happened a very, very long time ago in a tiny village far off in the mountains of New Mexico. That little village was so lost in the mountains, hardly anyone ever visited that village. Only the traveling priest would show up every 3 or 4 years to baptize the babies and bless all the marriages that had taken place in the years in between. And when the snow was deep on the ground, the way it was the year this story happened, no one at all would come or go from that little village. And in tiny villages way back in those times, nobody had a calendar. The people would just rely on the wise old timers to tell them when an important date was approaching. In that village, it was an old woodcutter. His name was Teofilo. He could tell them if a holiday was arriving. But with all the snow and all the cold that year, That old woodcutter is kept so busy splitting firewood, carrying it to the little adobe houses to keep them warm. He wasn't paying attention to how the days were just passing and passing. He did not realize how close it was getting to Christmas. As Christmas got nearer, it began to seem like Christmas would just be another snowy day that year. However, there was someone in that village who never forgot Christmas. It was the old woodcutter's little gray burro, his little donkey. Well, of course, that makes sense. All the animals of the stable love Christmas. They were all in the stable on that first Christmas morning. But no one loves it more than the donkey. It was the donkey who carried Mary on the long journey down to Bethlehem. And even though the poor donkey is abused and over, do when we know that we are appreciated. So when Christmas Eve arrived that year, and the donkey saw that nothing had been done to prepare for Christmas, he thought he'd better do something. He called a meeting of all the animals in the stable. He told them it looked like the people had lost track of the date. They didn't seem to know that the next day was going to be Christmas. Well, right away, the rooster took charge of the meeting. The rooster started to crow, "Yo sé qué hacer, yo sé qué hacer. I know what to do." And the rooster organized all the animals for a Christmas play. The rooster assigned a part to each animal and told them to go and practice. And then a short time before midnight, they would come together again and the fun would begin. Well, that night at midnight, all of the people were snoring away in their beds. And the rooster flew up to the roof of the little village church, and the rooster started crowing. The rooster crowed like this: "Cristo nació! Cristo nació!" And then down in the village plaza, the donkey brayed, "Donde?" Back and forth across the plaza, clucking, "Paqué, paqué, paqué, paqué." And then the duck quacked, "Pass, pass." And the old cow lowed, "Oh, more." The people all sat up in their beds. The husbands and wives looked at each other in surprise. The children came running to their parents to find out what was going on. Now everyone was wide awake, and the animals began their play again. The rooster crowed, "Cristo nació!" Everybody heard it. Everyone understood what the rooster was saying. Christ is born. Cristo nació. And then the donkey brayed the question, "Donde?" Where, the donkey was asking. "En donde?" And the goat bleated the answer, "En Belén." In Bethlehem. And then the hen clucked her question, "Paqué, paqué, paqué." What for, the hen was asking. "Para qué?" And then the duck and the cow gave the answer everyone knows. Peace, space, and love amor. The people all said, Ay, será la Nochebuena. This must be Christmas Eve, they said. And they jumped out of their beds. They went to work preparing for Christmas. They cooked and they baked. They decorated their houses. They lined the road into the little village with luminarias. And then the next morning, they all went out to the stable to thank the animals. They said, gracias, animalitos, muchísimas gracias. They probably thought the animals would just shrug and say, por nada, you're welcome. But that's not what happened. Instead, they just heard the rooster crow. They heard the donkey bray. And the goat bleated. The hen just cluck, 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 cluck. The duck quacked. And the old cow just moo. Nobody understood exactly what had happened. But never again did the people forget to prepare for Christmas Eve. Of course, these days, they do have calendars in the village. They know when it's Christmas Eve. And on Christmas Eve, they are not snoring away in their beds. They're at the little village church for the midnight mass. And do you know what they call the midnight mass on Christmas Eve? That mass is called La Misa del Gallo, the Mass of the Rooster. And some people say it has that name because the rooster woke everyone up one Christmas Eve many, many, many years ago. Other people, when they hear that, will say, well, that isn't fair. It was really the donkey's whole idea. But you don't have to worry about that. Even though the little gray donkey just brayed that Christmas morning a long time ago, something had changed about that donkey. On the donkey's gray back, there was a line of darker hair that ran up and down its spine, and then another line of darker hair that ran across its shoulders, and together those two streaks of dark hair made a cross on its back. And to this day, every donkey has a cross on its back. The next time you see a burro, look at it and you can see the cross on its back. And then remember, the little gray donkey has a cross on its back because the donkey is the one who never forgets when it's Christmas. So even if we lose all of our calendars, maybe the donkey will still be around to remind us when it gets to be Christmas Eve. Oh, as I mentioned before, this is really the storytelling season. The holiday season is a great name too, because there are so many different holidays at this time of year. One very important event at this time of year is called solstice. The shortest day of the year arrives, and then the days start getting longer and longer once again. Solstice was also always a time when people told stories. I have a story I think of as a solstice story. And this story is an old Native American story I don't know which culture it came from because I just heard it and then I started telling the story. But I do know that it's one of many, many, many stories that start out at the beginning of time. And they say that way back in the beginning, things were very different. They did not have days and nights in a nice steady rhythm the way we have them now. Instead, it might be dark for 10 years in a row, and then light for one day. And then it might be dark for 8 long years, and then light for one day. Well, some of the animals were happy with that because they liked the darkness. We call those animals nocturnal. They love the nighttime. But you probably know not every animal is nocturnal. Many animals prefer the daytime. Well, like the rabbit. The rabbit would feel safer if she could see her enemies creeping up on her. The squirrel didn't like the darkness because the squirrel always wanted to run down to the end of a branch and then take a long jump and catch another branch and go running up that branch. But in the darkness, the squirrel would miss the second branch and fall and hit her head almost every time. The birds didn't like it. Well, except for the owl. The owl was perfectly happy, but not the rest of the birds. Not even the hawk and the eagle, because they could hunt better when it was light out. So one day when the sun happened to be shining, the eagle flew clear to gather the animals together and to let them talk about it, however they wanted things to be. However much darkness and daylight they wanted, the sun said he would make it that way. Eagle flew back down and called a meeting of the animals, and each animal stood up and said how he thought things should be arranged. The biggest, strongest animal spoke first. So Bear stood up, and Bear said, 10 years of darkness, one day. Some of the animals agreed with Bear, but other animals had different ideas. The skunk said, I think there should be 4 years of darkness, then 2 days. The badger said, oh, why can't it just be dark all the time? But the rabbit jumped up. The rabbit said, no, it should be light all the time. The bluebird sang, my children need daylight. My children need daylight. There were a lot of different ideas. The last animal to speak was the frog. Frog had an idea no one else had thought of. The frog stood up. The frog said, one day, one night, one day, one night. Most of the animals saw that was the best idea of all. The day and the night should just follow one another like black and white beads along a string. But Bear wasn't going to let that weak little frog tell him how things should be. And the bear kept growling, 10 years of darkness, one day. Before long, all the animals were in two groups. The few that agreed with Bear, and then all the rest of them that agreed with Frog. And they could not settle their difference. So the eagle had to fly back up to the sun and tell the sun, now the animals were in two groups and they couldn't settle the argument. The sun said there was only one thing to do. They should have a contest. Each group should pick an animal to speak for it. And the animal that could say how he wanted things to be the longest, without stopping, would get things his way. Eagle came down and told all the other animals, and right away Bear said he would talk for his group. He laughed when he heard Frog was going to talk for the other group. Bear thought he could roar so loud you wouldn't even hear the frog. When the time for the contest arrived, Bear went and stood on one bank of the river. Frog hopped out onto the other river bank. Bear didn't even wait for the signal to begin. Right away he started growling. 10 years of darkness. One day. And then when the signal came, Frog started. One day, one night, one day, one night. At first you could hardly even hear the frog because Bear was so loud. But Bear is not used to talking all the time. His throat started getting sore. His voice was growing hoarse. 10 years of darkness, one day. He snuck down to the river and he drank some water. His voice came back again. 10 years of darkness, one day. But his voice didn't come back for very long. He started losing his voice again. And then the next thing you know, Bear's mouth was moving, but there was no sound coming out. But on the other side of the river, Frog was just getting warmed up. One day, one night, one day, one night, one day, one night. Finally, the bear had to admit he had been beaten. He walked away grumbling to himself. But the frog never did stop talking. Even today, if you go out by the water, you can hear the frog out there in the evening. And if you knew how to speak his language, you would hear that the frog is saying, one day, one night, one day, one night. And that's how things have been ever since. There has been a day followed by a night, another day, and then another night. But you probably know when the weather turns cold in the fall of the year, Frog hides under a rock and goes to sleep. After the frog has gone to sleep, Bear starts growling again. 10 years of darkness, one day. The sun can hear the bear. The sun is a little bit frightened of Bear. That makes the sun travel a little more quickly across the sky each day. That explains why the days get shorter and shorter all through the fall of the year. But when the really cold weather sets in, Bear finds a cave in the mountains and the bear goes to sleep. After the bear has gone to sleep, the sun starts feeling braver and will travel a little more slowly across the sky each day. That explains why the days get longer and longer all through the late winter and into the spring. And the story explains something else. This story explains why it is that it's still not the biggest and loudest and strongest one who gets his way. The one who gets things his way is the one who has a good idea and will say it over and over and over and over and not stop saying it for anything. That's how you can get things your way too. Can get you in trouble though. When I was a kid, I would ask for something over and over until I got myself in trouble. You have to make sure it's a good idea. And most of the time, it works. Oh, we're bouncing around to different things that make this the holiday season. And of course, everybody knows this is also the Hanukkah season. This year it came a bit early, but this is also the season when Hanukkah is celebrated. So I will tell you a Hanukkah story. This story happened in a faraway land, way back in the old times. There, in a city in that faraway land, there was a very talented tailor. A tailor is a person who makes clothing for people. This tailor was so good at his trade, the richest, the most powerful men in that city would come to him to have their clothing made. But the tailor himself went about almost dressed in rags. Well, it happened one year, just about the beginning of Hanukkah, that a fierce winter storm blew into the city. The icy wind howled through the streets. Snow was piling up all around. And that morning the tailor walked to his shop, shivering with the cold. When he got inside, he said to himself, "Look at this. All over this city, wealthy men are going around wearing clothes that I have made for them, fine, warm overcoats. And I don't even have a coat to protect me from the cold." So he decided that before he stowed a single stitch for anyone else, he was going to make himself an overcoat. He dug through the box of scraps. He pulled out all the warm woolen cloth he could find. And then he cut and he snipped and he stitched and he sewed, and he saw he had just enough to make an overcoat. He made a snug, warm overcoat with a high collar he could turn up around his ears and tails that went almost to the ground. Well, it is true that the cloth on the front was not exactly the same as the cloth on the back, and the right side didn't really match the left side, but it was a fine, warm overcoat. And he wore it through the winter, day in and day out. And with all that wearing, it wore out. The first gentler days of spring were just arriving when he took off his overcoat one morning and he saw the shoulders had worn thin and the hem at the bottom, it was so ragged, it was just about to come apart. But he looked it over more carefully and he saw that the cloth below the shoulders had held up rather well, and one side of the front was in pretty good shape. So he cut, and he snipped, and he stitched, and he sewed, and he saw he had just enough to make a jacket. Well, a jacket was what he needed now that the warmer days of spring were arriving. He made himself a very stylish jacket, and he wore it through the springtime, day in and day out, and with all that wearing, it wore out. It was just when the first warm days of early summer were arriving that he looked at his jacket and realized there was a big tear under one sleeve. There was a hole in the elbow of another sleeve. But this time, the shoulders had held up very well, and the front of the jacket was in usable shape. So he cut, and he snipped, he stitched, and he sewed, and he saw that he had just enough to make a vest. Wouldn't a vest be just the thing for him to wear in his shop on warm summer days? He could put a little pocket on each side of the front so he could hook his thumbs in there and wiggle his fingers at his high-class customers. He made an elegant vest with two little points sticking down on either side in the front, one little point sticking down in the middle of the back, a thumb pocket on either side. He wore it through the summer, day in and day out. With all that wearing, it wore out. The cool, gentle days of autumn were beginning when he noticed that both of the thumb pockets on the front of his vest had torn off because he kept wiggling his fingers too hard at his high-class customers. And the two little points at the front and one little point in the back, they had almost flattened out with wear. But the cloth above the pockets, that was in good shape. So he cut, and he snipped, he stitched, and he sewed. And he saw that he had just enough to make a hat. A hat would be just the thing for him to wear when he went strolling in the park by the river on autumn evenings. You know, nothing catches the lady's eye like a hat tipped at a rakish angle. He made himself a fine, jaunty hat, and he wore it in the evening as he went walking, day in and day out. And with all that wearing, it wore out. Oh, he took off his hat one afternoon and looked at it more carefully, and he saw that the sides had almost worn through from his tugging so hard to put it at just the right angle on his head. The crest of the hat was also worn from the sunlight, but the lining had held up. There were a few bits of good cloth on the outside, so he cut and he snipped, he stitched and he sewed. He had just enough to make a button. Now, a fine cloth button on the front of a man's trousers always give him a sense of confidence. A bone button, a wooden button, they're fine if all you care about is holding up your pants. But a cloth button has style to it. He made a voluptuous cloth button. He wore it on the front of his trousers day in and day out, and with all that wearing, it wore out. It was just about the beginning of Hanukkah the next year when the tailor felt something pop and he saw his button fall to the floor. He picked it up and looked at it and realized there was not one single thread of that button that wasn't worn out. But there was just enough to make a story to tell the children for Hanukkah. You just heard it. Oh boy. I think I'll finish up with what the Christmas story I heard the most when I was a kid. I think maybe I understood about half of it. And I grew up a long time ago, so I imagine if kids are growing up now, they understand about a quarter of the story. But that's okay. Everybody still loves it. It's probably the best loved Christmas story in the English language. It goes like this. 'Twas the night before Christmas, and all through the house, not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. The stockings were hung by the chimney with care, in hopes that St. Nicholas soon would be there. The children were nestled all snug in their beds, while visions of sugar plums danced in their heads. Mama in her kerchief, and I in my cap, had just settled our brains for a long winter's nap. When out on the lawn there arose such a clatter, I sprang from my bed to see what was the matter. Away to the window I ran like a flash, tore open the shutters and threw up the sash. The moon on the breast of the new fallen snow gave a luster of midday to objects below. When what to my wondering I should appear but a miniature sleigh and 8 tiny reindeer. With a little old driver so lively and quick, I knew in a moment it must be Saint Nick. More rapid than eagles, his coursers they came. He whistled and shouted and called them by name. Now Dasher, now Dancer, now Prancer and Vixen. On Comet, on Cupid, on Dunder and Blitzen. To the top of the porch, to the top of the wall. Now dash away, dash away, dash away all. Like dry leaves that before the wild hurricane fly, when they meet with an obstacle mount to the sky, so up to the housetop his coursers they flew, with a sleigh full of toys and St. Nicholas too. And then in a twinkling I heard on the roof the prancing and pawing of each little hoof. As I drew in my head and was turning around, down the chimney St. Nicholas came with a bound. He was dressed all in fur from his head to his foot. His clothes were all covered with ashes and soot. A bundle of toys he had flung on his back. He looked like a peddler just emptying his pack. His eyes, how they twinkled, his dimples, how merry. His cheeks were like roses, his nose like a cherry. His droll little mouth was drawn up like a bow. The beard on his chin was as white as the snow. The stump of a pipe he held tight in his teeth. The smoke it encircled his head like a wreath. He was chubby and plump, a right jolly old elf. Laughed when I saw him in spite of myself. A wink of his eye and a twist of his head soon gave me to know I had nothing to dread. He said not a word, but went straight to his work. He filled all the stockings, then turned with a jerk, and laying a finger aside of his nose and giving a nod, up the chimney he rose. He sprang to his sleigh, to his team gave a whistle. Away they all flew like the dawn of a thistle. Lo vi alejarse, mientras decía, Feliz Navidad, y que tengan buen día. Merry Christmas, he said, and have a good day. And thank you so much for listening to those stories.
Oh my gosh, my golly, Mr. Hayes. That was spectacular. Thank you so much. Listening to you always brings a tear to my eye and warmth to my heart, and I think I speak for all of us. There's a few of us here in this room, a few staff of Las Golondrinas, when I say that just thank you for reminding us all that we have that childlike sense of wonder in us, especially around the holidays. And not only are you unmatched in storytelling, but I want to take a minute to share with our audience here a few of your wonderful books. So for those of last-minute Christmas shoppers out there, we do carry a lot of these in our store at Las Golondrinas, but unfortunately, we are closed for this season. So, Mr. Hayes, you're going to have to tell us where these shoppers can get these books if they're looking for Christmas presents. Otherwise, they're here in our shop.
Stores around town, you'll be able to find them. Collected Works always has a good selection. That's a good place to start.
Excellent. So right here, the ones that we carry are Estrellita de Oro, Little Gold Star. Not sure where the camera is. Read out the titles here. The Lovesick Skunk. Oh my goodness. That sounds like a good one.
Stories.
The ones we carry here in our shop as well are autographed by you. La Llorona, the Weeping Woman, a classic New Mexican Halloween tale. You joined us this year for Spirits of New Mexico, and we were so happy to have you as part of that spooky event. Pájaro Verde, the Green Bird. Another great title. And My Pet Rattlesnake. Ooh, that sounds like a fun one. And this one, Don't Say a Word, Mama. No digas nada, Mama. Wonderful. And for those of you at home, for more Joe Hayes, make sure to visit him on YouTube. Look up Joe Hayes Storyteller. This video, as well as all of our videos from our Golondrinas live sessions, are up on YouTube. Just look up Las Golondrinas channel. You'll find this wonderful storytelling by Mr. Hayes, as well as the other videos that we've done over the last 2 years. Remember to follow us on our social media, Facebook and Instagram, both at SF Golondrinas. You can always visit our website for more information at golondrinas.org. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Mr. Hayes, for being...
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for listening to the stories.
Oh, it was wonderful. It was just such a pleasure to have you here in our exhibit hall. And to all of our wonderful viewers out there, our family, our friends, our community, thank you for a wonderful 2021 season. We are so excited to welcome you back next year in 2022 when we'll be celebrating our 50th celebration. Mr. Hayes, will you come back and help us to celebrate?
I'll come running.
Excellent. Well, there you have it, folks. We wish you, all of us here at Las Golondrinas, we wish you and yours a very happy, healthy, safe, with all the tidings of good cheer, healthy, absolutely wonderful holiday season, and a very prosperous new year. And we'll see you then. Thank you all so much. Bye-bye.